It all started with a fairy tale. Claire Harrington had always been the epitome of grace and beauty. Her sharp wit, paired with her stunning looks, had captivated James from the moment they met at a friend's wedding. He, a successful architect, was drawn to her creative energy, and she, a freelance graphic designer, admired his structured approach to life. Their connection was immediate, a whirlwind romance that soon led to marriage. Their life together, nestled in a charming suburban home in Denver, Colorado, was everything they had ever dreamed of. The house, a sprawling property on the outskirts of the city, was meant to be their sanctuary, a place where they could build a future, free from the pressures of the world. It was the perfect setting for a picture-perfect couple. Yet, beneath the surface of their idyllic life, there was an undercurrent of unease, a tension Claire couldn't quite shake. The quiet hum of everyday life, once a source of comfort, now felt suffocating. James's career demanded long hours, and Claire, though dedicated to her work, began to feel the weight of isolation. The quiet evenings once spent in each other's company slowly dwindled as James's attention was increasingly consumed by his professional life. Then came Dorothy. Dorothy Harrington, James's mother, had lived independently for years after her husband's death. But with her health in decline, she needed more care, and James, ever the dutiful son, insisted she move in with them. Claire had no choice but to agree, albeit reluctantly. The decision was made one evening, as the crisp air of autumn hung in the air, a decision that would change everything. From the moment Dorothy stepped into their home, something shifted. Dorothy, with her frail but spirited presence, was a constant reminder of the family bond between her and James, a bond that Claire had always felt on the periphery of. Initially, Dorothy was polite, quiet, and grateful, trying her best not to intrude. She kept to herself, reading, knitting, and occasionally joining them for meals. But the dynamic of the household was never the same. Claire's private sanctuary, her home, her life, now felt like it was no longer hers. The small things, the familiar rhythms of her daily routine, began to unravel. It wasn't Dorothy's fault, Claire knew that. But each small intrusion felt like a barb, slowly pricking at her sense of control. The kitchen, once her domain, was now filled with Dorothy's unsolicited advice on how to cook or organize. The conversations James and Claire once shared over dinner now included Dorothy's opinions, sometimes welcome, but often grating. The familiarity they once had, the intimacy of their shared space, was slowly being replaced by the silent tension that hung between them. The cracks were subtle at first. A comment here, a misplaced gesture there. But over time, they grew wider, more pronounced. James, torn between his love for Claire and his devotion to his mother, tried to mediate, but Claire could see the growing distance between them. She was no longer his priority, his mother was. Claire's frustration simmered just beneath the surface, a quiet storm of resentment building. As the days passed, she felt the sting of being sidelined, the sting of no longer being the most important person in James's life. And with every passing day, the bond between her and James seemed to fray more. Each time he defended Dorothy, each time he justified her presence in their home, the resentment deepened in Claire's heart. What was once a fairy tale of love and promise now felt like a prison. And Claire could feel the walls closing in. In the early days of their marriage, Claire and James seemed invincible. Their love was easy, almost effortless. They were a perfect match, or so it appeared. Every corner of their beautiful home in suburban Denver whispered promises of a lifetime of happiness. Claire had always admired James's quiet strength, his calm and steady demeanor that balanced her creative chaos. He, in turn, admired her fiery spirit, her sharp mind, and the way she lit up the room with her laughter. It had all seemed so perfect. Their home, a stunning ranch-style house nestled on the edge of the city, was an oasis of peace. The walls were adorned with Claire's art, colorful prints that reflected her personality, while James's taste for modern, clean lines gave the space a sense of order. It was a house they built together, a reflection of their dreams. They spent weekends hosting barbecues in their expansive backyard, laughing with friends, sharing stories, and savoring each moment of quiet happiness. But as time went on, the cracks began to form, subtle at first, but undeniable. Claire started to notice the small changes, things that once felt comforting now felt stifling. Their routine had always been their anchor, but now it was beginning to feel like a tether, pulling her down into a sea of frustration. She began to resent the quiet evenings, the ones where James would return late from work, his mind still preoccupied with the day's challenges. And even when he was home, his thoughts often wandered elsewhere, drifting toward his mother. Dorothy's arrival was the first major shift in their lives. James, always the dutiful son, had made it clear from the start that bringing his mother into their home was the right thing to do. Claire had known it was coming, James had spoken about it for weeks, perhaps even months. But knowing something was inevitable didn't make it easier to bear. She wasn't prepared for the weight it would place on her shoulders. In the beginning, Dorothy was gracious. She didn't want to be a burden. She settled into the guest room with only a few suitcases, quietly adjusting to the new rhythm of their home. She tried not to interfere, but Claire could feel her presence in every corner of the house. The constant murmur of Dorothy's voice in the background during dinner, the small, familiar habits of the older woman that started to invade Claire's carefully crafted routines, it all built up. And with each passing day, Claire's tolerance for the situation waned. At first, she tried to be accommodating. She invited Dorothy into their conversations, tried to make her feel welcome. But no matter how hard Claire tried, a part of her began to feel suffocated. She could no longer enjoy the little moments of peace that used to be her refuge. The home that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt more like a stage, with Claire performing her role as the doting daughter-in-law for James's sake. James, for his part, was caught between his two worlds. He loved Claire, but he also felt a profound sense of responsibility for his mother. Dorothy had cared for him all his life, and now, as her health began to fail, it was his turn to care for her. He couldn't fathom not doing what he felt was right, but he also couldn't understand why Claire was struggling so much with the arrangement. To him, it seemed simple: Dorothy was family, and family took care of one another. He didn't see why Claire couldn't just accept it. Claire, however, felt betrayed. It wasn't that she didn't care about Dorothy, it was that her marriage felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She felt as if she were being pushed aside, as if her needs were secondary to the needs of his mother. Her own voice, her own desires, were lost in the shuffle of constant compromise. The intimacy she had once shared with James seemed to disappear the moment Dorothy stepped through the door. As the weeks passed, Claire grew increasingly withdrawn. The woman who had once filled the house with laughter and energy now moved through it like a shadow. The little things that used to bring her joy, working on her design projects, spending time alone with James, now felt empty. She began to isolate herself, retreating to her studio, where the hum of her computer and the rhythmic clicking of her mouse were the only sounds that provided any relief from the tension she felt at home. James noticed the change. At first, he attributed it to the stresses of life. After all, Claire was still adjusting to her new role as a wife, and now she had to share their home with Dorothy. But as the days wore on, he grew concerned. He tried talking to her, but the conversations always seemed to circle around Dorothy, always coming back to her presence, her needs, her demands. Claire would tell him that she was fine, but her eyes told a different story. There was something in them, something he couldn't name, that made him uneasy. Still, James pressed on, trying to mediate between the two women he loved. He suggested that they all try harder to make it work, that they be patient with one another. But Claire's patience was running thin, and every suggestion felt like a hollow attempt to placate her. She began to confide in her friends, telling them how stressed she was, how her entire life had shifted, and how she felt as if she were losing herself in the process. Some of her friends advised her to hold on, to try to see things from James's perspective. Others whispered that James's loyalty to his mother would always overshadow their marriage. Claire didn't want to believe them, but deep down, she knew they were right. As her resentment festered, the small annoyances of everyday life became magnified. The way Dorothy would criticize Claire's cooking, rearrange the kitchen, or offer unsolicited advice on how to keep the house clean, all of it started to eat away at Claire's composure. Her once carefully curated life, one she had fought so hard to build, was falling apart, piece by piece. The final straw came one night when Dorothy criticized Claire's choice of dessert. It was a simple matter, one that would have once been dismissed with a laugh, but now it felt like a personal attack. Claire felt the heat rise in her chest, a wave of frustration that had been building for months. She lashed out, accusing James of always taking his mother's side. The argument was fierce, raw, and unrelenting. James tried to mediate, but his efforts only seemed to fan the flames of Claire's anger. She felt trapped. And with that feeling, the seeds of something darker began to take root. The days blurred together for Claire Harrington, each one indistinguishable from the next, yet each carrying with it the same weight, the same suffocating feeling that threatened to swallow her whole. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, and the life she had once cherished was slipping through her fingers like sand. The battle was no longer just between her and Dorothy. It was a war waged within herself, a struggle between the woman she was and the woman she was becoming. Claire had always prided herself on being independent, on making her own choices and standing by them. She had built her career from the ground up, crafted a life she could be proud of, and entered marriage with a deep belief that love could conquer all. But now, as she looked around their home, she saw nothing but the dissonance of broken dreams, the realization that her life was no longer hers to control. James, the man she had married, had become an enigma to her, someone she no longer recognized. His steadfast loyalty to his mother, his inability to see her pain, had shattered the image of him she had once adored. Each time James defended Dorothy, each time he brushed off Claire's frustrations as if they were nothing more than a passing irritation, the gap between them grew wider. It wasn't just that he was choosing his mother over her, it was the fact that he couldn't, or wouldn't, understand the depth of her suffering. The isolation Claire felt grew heavier with each passing day. She wasn't just living with Dorothy, she was living in a marriage that felt more like a partnership of convenience than a union of two people who truly understood each other. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt like a stage, a place where Claire had to play the role of the dutiful wife, hiding her growing resentment behind a mask of politeness. She smiled at Dorothy, chatted about trivial matters, all the while feeling like she was sinking deeper into a pit of despair. She tried to convince herself that she could bear it, that the tension would eventually ease and things would go back to normal, but with each passing day, the thought seemed more and more like a lie. Claire's feelings of abandonment by James were amplified by his persistent belief that everything was fine, that the dynamic between the three of them could somehow work. Every time she tried to talk to him, to explain how she was feeling, his responses were defensive and dismissive. He seemed to believe that his mother's needs were a natural part of family life, something she should simply accept. But it wasn't that simple for Claire. She wasn't just being asked to accept Dorothy's presence, she was being asked to accept a version of her life that no longer resembled the one she had envisioned. She was being asked to put her own needs aside, to silently bear the weight of a situation she had no say in. And that was something Claire could no longer tolerate. The frustration grew into something darker, something Claire had never anticipated. It wasn't just resentment anymore. It was a gnawing sense of injustice, a bitterness that festered deep within her chest. She couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened, but at some point, her love for James had shifted. She no longer saw him as the man she had married, the man who had once promised her a life of love and companionship. Now, he was just another obstacle in her way. The first time Claire truly considered the unthinkable was a moment that still haunted her, a quiet morning, the sun just beginning to filter through the blinds, casting long shadows across the living room. She had been sitting at the kitchen table, her mind racing, her eyes fixed on the steaming cup of coffee in front of her. James was out, as he often was in the mornings, leaving her alone with her thoughts. And in that silence, the idea took root. What if Dorothy wasn't here anymore? What if the weight of her presence, the suffocating force of her constant need, could simply disappear? The thought was a fleeting one at first, quickly dismissed as absurd. But the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like the only way out. Claire had always believed that she was a good person, that she would never consider hurting anyone, especially not Dorothy, the woman who had raised James. But now, faced with the relentless strain of living in this new reality, the thought didn't seem so impossible. She began to think of the possibilities, a quick, painless solution to a problem that had become insurmountable. She told herself that it would be the only way to restore balance to her life, to reclaim what she had lost. But deep down, Claire knew this was a slippery slope. She wasn't just fighting against Dorothy, she was fighting against herself. She had been pushed to the brink, and the pressure of it all was starting to crack her. There was a part of her that was ashamed, a part that recoiled at the darkness of her thoughts. She knew that what she was considering was wrong, but the desperation she felt clouded her judgment. She justified it to herself, it was the only way to make things right. And yet, with every passing day, her resolve grew weaker. Guilt began to gnaw at her, her conscience fighting against the darker part of her mind that told her there was no other way. The strain of the situation was becoming unbearable. Claire had always been independent, strong, able to face challenges head-on. But now, she felt like a shell of herself, worn down by the weight of her own emotions. The woman who had once been full of life and passion was now consumed by bitterness, trapped in a life that no longer made sense to her. She began to withdraw even further, pulling away from James, retreating into her work, and avoiding any situation where she might have to confront the reality of her marriage. The tension between her and Dorothy grew worse, and the moments of silence between Claire and James were filled with an unspoken resentment that neither knew how to address. Claire felt as though she was losing herself, piece by piece. But it wasn't just her marriage that was slipping away. It was her sense of self. She had always been a woman in control of her life, someone who could make decisions and take charge of her destiny. But now, she felt powerless, stuck in a situation she never chose, unable to find a way out. The frustration, the guilt, and the bitterness swirled together into something far darker than she had ever anticipated. And with that darkness, Claire realized that the path she was on had no easy way back. Claire Harrington had always believed that time had a way of healing all wounds. But now, as the weeks dragged on, she realized that some wounds weren't meant to heal. They festered, growing deeper, more painful, until they consumed you entirely. Every conversation with James, every passing moment in the house with Dorothy, felt like a weight she could no longer bear. She had become a stranger to herself, a woman who no longer recognized the reflection in the mirror. Each day was like walking on a tightrope, the slightest shift in balance threatening to send her crashing to the ground. But what terrified Claire more than the ever-present tension was the cold, unsettling feeling that had settled in her chest. The thought of what she had considered in her darker moments, that Dorothy could simply vanish from their lives, had transformed from an idle daydream into a twisted necessity. It wasn't something she thought of constantly, but the idea began to creep into her mind at unexpected moments, while she stirred her morning coffee, while she worked on her design projects late at night, even while lying next to James in their bed, pretending to sleep. It lingered like a shadow, following her every move, a constant reminder of her own desperation. The more she thought about it, the more the solution seemed clear. Dorothy's death, though tragic, would restore the life she had lost. It would bring her back to the woman she once was, the woman who had dreams, who had ambitions, who didn't feel trapped in a loveless marriage. Her mind, once full of creativity and ideas, was now filled with thoughts darker than she could have ever imagined. She knew it was wrong, deep down, she knew. But the guilt she felt was nothing compared to the relief she imagined. The pain, the suffocating pressure, would all be over. There would be peace. And for the first time in a long time, the idea of peace felt like a lifeline. The final decision came one evening after another heated argument. It had been a small thing, a disagreement over dinner arrangements. Dorothy had made one of her signature dishes, a simple meal that Claire didn't particularly care for, but it was her mother-in-law's way of asserting herself in the house. Claire had been quiet, seething with frustration as Dorothy talked about the recipe, describing in detail how James had always loved it when they were growing up. It wasn't just the food. It was everything. "Why don't you ever let me help?" Dorothy's voice had been calm, but there was a slight edge to it, the tone of someone who had long since ceased to care about intruding. Claire felt a surge of emotion, anger rising like a storm in her chest. She couldn't take it anymore. It wasn't the meal. It wasn't even the fact that Dorothy was in their house. It was the constant feeling of being invisible, of being sidelined in the very life she had built. She had been patient. She had tried to be kind. But patience had worn thin. There was no more kindness left in her, only a growing desperation. She shot a glance at James, who was distracted with his phone, not noticing the brewing storm in the air. His mother had his attention, and Claire had nothing. "You always take her side, don't you?" she snapped. "You've completely forgotten about me." James looked up, confused, but defensive. "Claire, not this again," he muttered, standing up and walking to the sink, clearly tired of the same conversation. Claire stood still, her fists clenched at her sides. "I can't do this anymore, James. I don't even know who you are anymore." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Claire felt as if the walls were closing in on her. The tension was unbearable, and yet, somehow, her mind wandered back to the thought, the one she had been trying to suppress. What if she could end it all, just end it? Dorothy would never be a problem again. James would finally be free to focus on her, to love her again. Their life could go back to how it had been, or so she believed. She excused herself and retreated to her studio, where the hum of her computer and the isolation of her space gave her a sense of control. She worked in silence, her mind running in circles, until she couldn't concentrate on anything anymore. The solution that had once seemed like a fleeting thought now felt like a necessity. The plan was simple. Quiet. Discreet. Claire had researched methods, even casually enough to make it seem like part of her everyday life. The first time she had come across aconite, a potent toxin found in monkhood plants, she had dismissed it as just another dark thought. But the more she read about it, the more it seemed like the perfect solution, a poison that could be slipped into food, one that mimicked the symptoms of a natural illness. No one would suspect a thing. It would appear as though Dorothy had simply succumbed to her age and health issues. The idea sickened her, but it also soothed her. Claire knew she was crossing a line, but the line had already been crossed long ago. The only thing left was to act. As she prepared her first dose, Claire's hands shook, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins felt like power. She was in control now. For the first time in months, she felt as though she was taking back her life. She added a small amount of aconite to a bowl of soup, carefully stirring it in, watching as the powdered substance dissolved almost effortlessly. Dorothy loved soup. It was comfort food, a staple in their home. And tonight, Claire would be the one to serve it to her. But what she didn't anticipate was the moment of hesitation that followed. As she carried the bowl to the table, her heart thudded in her chest. She was so close now. But the guilt gnawed at her, twisting in her stomach like a knife. Was she really capable of this? Was this truly the answer? Dorothy sat at the table, smiling faintly as Claire set the bowl in front of her. The old woman's frail hands trembled as she reached for the spoon, her eyes filled with gratitude. Claire smiled back, but it felt hollow. She watched Dorothy eat, each spoonful making Claire feel a mixture of relief and dread. She was already in too deep. There was no turning back now. What happened next unfolded faster than Claire could have imagined. Dorothy's face contorted in pain. Her body shuddered as the poison began to take effect, the slow, cruel poison that Claire had meticulously planned for weeks. "James!" Claire cried out, her voice shaky. "Something's wrong with Mom. She's really sick." As Dorothy gasped for breath, clutching her chest in agony, Claire dialed 911, her voice trembling with fake panic. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but the poison was already doing its work. Dorothy was rushed to the hospital, but Claire knew, in her heart, that there was no hope. By the time Dorothy was pronounced dead, Claire felt something shift inside her. She felt relieved. But with that relief came a deeper, more insidious emotion, guilt. She had done it. And now, she would have to live with the consequences. As the paramedics rushed Dorothy to the hospital, Claire's mind raced, but in a detached way, as though her body were operating on autopilot, leaving her thoughts to follow the chaos in her wake. The ambulance had barely left the driveway before Claire found herself standing in the living room, staring at the door, at the empty space where Dorothy had been only moments before. The weight of what she had done was beginning to sink in, but she pushed it down, trying to convince herself that she had done what was necessary. After all, what else was she supposed to do? The relief, however, felt fleeting. The hours that followed Dorothy's departure to the hospital were a blur. James, frantic, called Claire multiple times, his voice filled with panic, asking what had happened. Claire was careful with her words, keeping her composure. She told him that Dorothy had collapsed suddenly, that she had been complaining of stomach pain earlier, but nothing seemed alarming at the time. When the paramedics arrived, she said, they had found her in worse condition than expected, and it was all so sudden. She played the part of the concerned wife perfectly, convincing herself that her performance was flawless. But inside, there was no peace. Claire felt as though she were slowly suffocating. The quiet hum of the house, once filled with the gentle rhythm of their daily lives, now felt deafening. She moved around, going through the motions, making tea, cleaning dishes, checking her phone for any news. But her mind wasn't in the present moment. It kept flashing back to that bowl of soup, the smoothness of the poison as it dissolved into the broth, and how, despite her best efforts, she hadn't felt the satisfaction she expected. No, there had been something else, something worse. A gnawing, visceral feeling deep in her gut that she couldn't shake off. At the hospital, Dorothy was declared dead. The doctors, after hours of trying to stabilize her, attributed her death to complications from her existing health conditions. Her heart had simply given out, they said. Claire was devastated, at least, she pretended to be. The reality of the situation was far murkier. But to the outside world, it seemed as though Dorothy's passing was a natural conclusion to a life that had grown frail with age. James, his heart shattered by the loss of his mother, clung to Claire with desperation. He cried in her arms, and Claire, though distant and conflicted, held him tight, offering words of comfort. It was as though she were an actress, reciting lines she knew too well, but with each passing hour, the guilt began to press harder on her chest. She felt as though she were being crushed under its weight, but she didn't know how to stop. Every time she told herself it was the only way to restore the life she once had, a new layer of doubt formed. The funeral was a somber affair. Claire stood beside James, her face painted with grief, as friends and family gathered to say goodbye to a woman who had lived a full life, even if she had been a source of strife in Claire's own. It was hard to reconcile the woman who had quietly joined them for meals and sat by the fire knitting in the evenings with the reality of what Claire had done. Dorothy was gone, and with her, Claire had hoped, would come the return of the life she felt she had lost. But it wasn't that simple. The days following the funeral were filled with a numbing silence. James buried himself in work, trying to distract himself from the aching hole in his heart. But it was clear that something had changed. The once tender connection between Claire and James had frayed, and in its place was an uneasy tension, an unspoken truth neither of them wanted to confront. Claire continued to play the role of the grieving wife, comforting James, but the cracks in their relationship were growing wider by the day. The more Claire tried to pretend everything was normal, the more her conscience screamed at her, reminding her that nothing would ever be the same. Meanwhile, the investigation into Dorothy's death continued. Initially, the doctors had ruled her passing as a result of natural causes, but something about the rapid progression of her symptoms didn't sit right with one of the nurses who had attended to her. Nurse Emma Collins, experienced and meticulous, had seen enough cases to recognize that Dorothy's condition had deteriorated far too quickly for an elderly woman already suffering from health problems. The sudden onset of severe pain and her inability to recover seemed abnormal, even for someone of Dorothy's age. The nurse's suspicions led to an autopsy, a routine procedure that would, in most cases, reveal nothing more than what the doctors had already determined. But what they found was far from ordinary. A potent toxin had been found in Dorothy's system. The authorities were immediately alerted, and Detective Laura Rogan was assigned to the case. Her experience in handling suspicious deaths told her that something was off, and as she began her investigation, it didn't take long to find troubling signs. A medical examiner's report confirmed the presence of aconite, a dangerous poison, in Dorothy's body. This discovery set in motion a chain of events that would unravel everything Claire thought she had controlled. Claire's world, which had seemed so neatly packaged just days earlier, was now spiraling out of control. Detective Rogan's first stop was the Harrington household, where the investigation began to unfold in ways Claire couldn't anticipate. When questioned, Claire had carefully rehearsed her responses, offering sympathy and concern, but Detective Rogan, with her sharp instincts, noticed the subtle unease in Claire's demeanor. There was something about her that didn't sit right, a guardedness that Claire couldn't hide. The investigation soon turned up evidence linking Claire to the poison. It wasn't just the toxic substance found in Dorothy's system, it was the meticulous search history on Claire's computer. Detailed inquiries into aconite and the methods of administering it pointed directly to Claire. The signs were undeniable, her research had been thorough, calculating. It painted a picture of premeditated murder. Claire was confronted with the evidence. Her heart raced as she realized the truth was no longer something she could hide. When Detective Rogan laid the facts out before her, Claire's facade crumbled. The guilt that had been eating her alive now broke free in a rush of tears, sobs, and regret. She confessed to everything, how her desperation had clouded her judgment, how she believed killing Dorothy was the only way to salvage her marriage and reclaim her life. But even as the words left her mouth, she couldn't take them back. The devastation on James's face when he learned the truth was something Claire would never forget. The man she had once loved, the man who had been her everything, now stood before her, broken. His mother, the one person who had been a constant in his life, was gone, and the woman he had trusted most had taken her from him. In the silence that followed, Claire realized that the life she had hoped for, the peace, the return of the intimacy with James, was no longer possible. What she had done couldn't be undone. In that moment, Claire understood the true cost of her actions. The peace she had imagined would come with Dorothy's death was a lie, a false hope built on a foundation of lies. And now, she would have to live with the consequences of those lies, knowing that some wounds, once inflicted, never truly heal. The days following Dorothy's death felt like a fog to Claire. She went through the motions, speaking with family, attending the funeral, and pretending to grieve the loss of a woman she had never fully accepted as part of her life. But beneath the surface, Claire's world was crumbling. The guilt of what she had done gnawed at her relentlessly, and she knew that, sooner or later, the truth would come to light. The thought haunted her every waking moment. James, for his part, was completely consumed by grief. He threw himself into his work, using it as a distraction from the pain of losing his mother. His anger at Claire's apparent detachment from the whole situation only grew, though he couldn't fully understand why Claire was behaving so strangely. She was his rock, and yet, in the wake of Dorothy's death, she seemed distant, colder than ever. He didn't know it yet, but the woman he had married, the woman he thought he knew inside and out, was hiding a dark secret. Detective Laura Rogan, a seasoned investigator with a keen eye for detail, had been following Dorothy's case from the beginning. It had started out as routine, an elderly woman passing away after complications related to age and existing health conditions. But something about the speed with which Dorothy's health deteriorated didn't sit right with Rogan. The timeline of Dorothy's sudden and severe symptoms, complaints of stomach pain followed by vomiting, then an almost immediate collapse, seemed far too abrupt for someone with her medical history. Rogan, experienced enough to know when something wasn't adding up, started digging deeper. Her instincts told her that there was more to this death than just old age. The more she examined Dorothy's case, the more questions arose. The rapid progression of symptoms seemed like nothing the doctors had encountered before, especially in someone who had been managing her health with such care. Rogan's suspicion grew stronger as she examined Dorothy's medical history and the circumstances surrounding her death. It was all too convenient. Her breakthrough came when a nurse who had attended to Dorothy, Nurse Emma Collins, came forward. Emma had been on shift the night Dorothy was admitted and had witnessed the swift decline firsthand. She noticed something odd about the speed with which Dorothy's health had deteriorated, something that, in her years of experience, was unusual even for someone of Dorothy's age. She didn't just get sick all of a sudden, Emma said during her interview with Rogan. She was complaining of stomach pain, but it wasn't like any normal digestive issue. It was intense, and it escalated so fast. It just didn't make sense. Rogan's suspicions were now fully piqued. With Emma's account, she ordered an autopsy to determine the exact cause of death. It was a routine procedure, one that would provide answers, but what they found was far from routine. The toxicology report revealed traces of aconite in Dorothy's system, a potent poison derived from the monkhood plant, one that could cause severe nausea, vomiting, and respiratory distress if ingested. The fact that it was in Dorothy's system raised alarm bells. Aconite was not a substance anyone would come into contact with casually. It was a rare poison, often associated with intentional harm. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. This was no accident. Dorothy hadn't died from her health complications. She had been murdered. With this newfound evidence, Rogan immediately turned her focus to the Harrington household. The poison had been administered slowly, likely over a period of time, making it difficult to detect until it was too late. The family was reeling from the loss, and it was time for the truth to come out. Rogan started with the most obvious person, Claire. She was Dorothy's daughter-in-law, and her role in the household was integral. The initial interviews with Claire revealed little of substance, but Rogan wasn't fooled. There was something about Claire's demeanor that didn't sit right. She was calm, almost too calm, especially considering the circumstances. Her answers were rehearsed, too measured. She seemed distant and cold in a way that only seemed to increase the longer Rogan spoke with her. Claire's account of the events leading up to Dorothy's death was standard. She had been with her mother-in-law throughout the day, watching over her, making sure she was comfortable. But something in her story didn't add up. Claire kept repeating that Dorothy had complained of feeling unwell but didn't seem to grasp the severity of it until it was too late. Rogan's gut told her that Claire was hiding something. The woman she was speaking to didn't match the image of the grieving, devastated daughter-in-law she was supposed to be. Rogan's investigation took her deeper into the Harrington home. A search of the kitchen revealed nothing out of the ordinary at first glance. But as she looked closer, one particular detail stood out, a small patch of monkhood plants growing in Claire's garden. They were easy to miss, hidden away in the corner of the yard. A quick sample was taken, and the lab confirmed what Rogan had feared. The plants contained aconite. Rogan's heart sank. The pieces were falling into place. Claire had been using the plants to poison Dorothy, subtly, over time. The motive, though still unclear, was beginning to make sense. The question now was, why? The detective dug deeper, looking into Claire's background, her relationships, and her life before the marriage. As she sifted through the details, she uncovered something that shocked her to the core. Claire had been researching poisons on her computer. A search history filled with queries about aconite, its effects, and how to use it to cause illness, all pointing to one chilling conclusion. Rogan had found the smoking gun. It was time for Claire to face the truth. When Claire was confronted with the evidence, her calm facade began to crumble. The weight of her actions hit her all at once. She knew there was no way to deny what she had done. The poison, the search history, the plants in her garden, it was all too much. Claire broke down. She confessed to the murder, describing how she had been driven to kill Dorothy out of desperation and frustration. She spoke of feeling trapped, of how her marriage had deteriorated and how Dorothy's presence in their home had pushed her to the brink. In Claire's mind, her actions had been justified. She believed that removing Dorothy would restore the happiness she had once known with James, the life they had built together. But now, facing the consequences of her crime, Claire realized the tragic irony. The peace she had sought through murder was gone, and the life she had once longed for was lost forever. The days that followed Claire's confession were a blur of legal proceedings, quiet conversations with her lawyer, and the relentless tick of the clock as her world slowly crumbled around her. She had once believed that taking Dorothy's life would restore her happiness, that it would bring back the intimacy and love she had once shared with James. But as she sat in the cold interrogation room, the realization washed over her like a tidal wave. What she had done could never be undone, and the life she longed for, the peace she dreamed of, would never be hers. James, devastated by the loss of both his mother and his wife, found himself drowning in disbelief. How had he missed the signs? How could the woman he had married, the woman he had trusted more than anyone, have done something so horrific? The guilt consumed him, and his thoughts became a whirlwind of regret, anger, and confusion. His mind couldn't reconcile the loving wife he had known with the cold-blooded murderer now standing before him. He had failed Dorothy, his mother, the woman who had given him life, who had raised him with such love. And he had failed Claire, the woman he thought he knew better than anyone. But the truth was undeniable. Claire had taken Dorothy's life, and in doing so, had destroyed not just the woman who had raised her husband, but the fragile foundation of their marriage. The weeks that followed Dorothy's death were filled with endless questions for James, endless pain for Claire. No one could understand what had driven her to such lengths. Friends and family alike were shocked, unable to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the woman who had committed such an unthinkable act. The legal system, as cold and impersonal as it was, moved forward with its own relentless momentum. Claire was charged with second-degree murder. Her trial was swift, but no less harrowing. The evidence against her was overwhelming: the poison, the search history, her confession, all of it painted a clear picture of premeditated murder. Claire's defense tried to paint her as a woman driven to madness by the pressure of caring for Dorothy, a woman who had been pushed to the brink by the unraveling of her marriage. But none of it excused what she had done. The jury deliberated for what seemed like an eternity, but the verdict was inevitable. Claire was found guilty. The judge sentenced her to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. The sentence was meant to acknowledge the severity of the crime, while also considering the emotional toll that had led Claire to this point. Yet, for Claire, no amount of time in prison would ever be enough to erase the weight of her actions, the guilt that would haunt her for the rest of her life. As the trial concluded, Claire's life as she knew it was over. The woman who had once been full of promise, full of love, was now a prisoner, not just of the law, but of her own mind. The life she had hoped for, the life that had once seemed so perfect, was gone. James, broken by the loss of both his mother and the woman he had loved, left their home in Denver, unable to bear the memories of what had transpired. He moved to another city, hoping for a fresh start, but the scars of the past would always remain. Claire's conviction marked the end of the tragedy that had shattered a family, but it was also the beginning of a painful journey of self-reflection. For the rest of her life, she would be forced to reckon with what she had done, the irreversible choice she had made, and the lives she had destroyed in the process. In prison, Claire had plenty of time to think. She spent long hours alone in her cell, replaying the events that had led her to murder. She thought about the desperation she had felt, the hopelessness that had driven her to believe that eliminating Dorothy would somehow restore balance to her life. But as the days passed, Claire realized the profound lesson that had been hidden in her crime, a lesson that, perhaps, she should have learned before she crossed that line. The true cost of desperation is incalculable. In her quest to reclaim her life, Claire had lost everything. Her marriage, her freedom, her peace of mind, all of it had been sacrificed for an illusion of control. She had thought that the removal of Dorothy would allow her to regain the happiness she once had with James, but in reality, it had only deepened her sense of isolation and despair. The very thing she had believed would save her had, in fact, destroyed her. As Claire sat in her cell, reflecting on the wreckage of her life, she realized that her actions were not born from a deep-seated hatred of Dorothy. They were born from a deep sense of emptiness, a longing for connection, for understanding, for a life that she felt had been stolen from her. She had not only killed her mother-in-law, she had killed the woman she had been. And in doing so, she had destroyed her marriage, her relationship with James, and any hope of redemption. Claire's journey in prison would not be an easy one. The guilt, the shame, and the pain would follow her for the rest of her life. But perhaps, in time, she could find a way to rebuild herself, to learn the lessons she had been so blind to before. The truth that emerged from this tragedy, the one Claire had failed to grasp until it was too late, was this: peace cannot be forced. It cannot be manufactured through violence or control. True peace comes from acceptance, understanding, and compassion. It was a lesson Claire learned too late, but it was a lesson that, in some small way, could still save her. For James, the road ahead would also be long. The betrayal he had suffered, the loss of both his mother and his wife, would haunt him for the rest of his life. Yet, with time, he would find a way to heal, to rebuild his own life, and perhaps even to forgive. The road to healing would be slow, but it was a road he would have to walk, one step at a time. As the years went by, Claire's life in prison became a slow march toward understanding. The life she once knew, the comforts of her marriage, the dreams she had once cherished, were gone, replaced by the cold, harsh reality of her confinement. Yet, in the stillness of her cell, amidst the monotony of her daily routine, Claire found something unexpected: clarity. The guilt, the shame, and the regret that had once consumed her now seemed like burdens too heavy to carry alone, and yet she had to. She had to carry them because, in some way, they had become a part of her, inextricable and real. It was here, behind bars, that Claire began to reflect on the choices she had made, choices that had irrevocably altered her life and the lives of those she loved. She had thought she was doing what was necessary to reclaim her happiness, to restore the love she once shared with James. But now, in the cold light of her reality, she understood that she had been mistaken. It wasn't Dorothy's death that would have given her peace. It was her own healing, her own ability to face her pain and confront her brokenness. And yet, that healing came at an extraordinary price. James, too, was left to rebuild his life without her. The man who had once shared his life so fully with Claire had lost both his mother and his wife in the span of a few short months. The sense of betrayal he felt was immeasurable. He had trusted Claire with everything he had, only to find that the woman he loved had, in a moment of desperate isolation, taken the life of his mother, the woman who had given him life, nurtured him, and loved him unconditionally. The weight of that loss, that betrayal, would follow him for years to come. But through time, and with the support of friends and family, James began the long journey of healing. He moved away from Denver, the city that had been the backdrop to so much pain, seeking solace in a new environment. He would never forget his mother or the woman he had loved, but with time, he would learn to forgive. Perhaps not fully, not completely, but in his own way, in his own time. And in doing so, he found a new sense of peace, one that came not from trying to reclaim the past, but from accepting the future, even with all its uncertainties. Claire, from her prison cell, often thought of James, wondering if he would ever truly forgive her. Would he ever understand how lost she had felt, how trapped in her own mind she had been? She knew that her actions had destroyed him, and she knew that no apology, no confession, could ever truly undo the harm she had caused. But as she spent her days contemplating the choices she had made, she understood that forgiveness wasn't something she could ask for. It was something James would have to offer, in his own time and on his own terms. Claire's time in prison was not without its moments of redemption, but it was a redemption born not of escaping her guilt, but of accepting it. In the end, she understood the greatest truth of all: peace is not something that can be forced. It cannot be manufactured through violence or control, nor through the destruction of others. True peace is something that must come from within, from confronting your own brokenness, from seeking healing for yourself, and, when possible, for others. As the years passed, Claire found a certain kind of acceptance, not the kind that erased the past, but the kind that allowed her to breathe again. It was not the life she had imagined, but it was hers. And in a small way, she had begun to heal, slowly, painfully, but steadily. For James, life went on. He remarried, built a new life, and found joy again. But his memories of Claire, and of the woman she had been, would always remain. He would never forget what had happened, he couldn't. But in time, he had learned the most important lesson of all: forgiveness. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was the only way forward. The journey of Claire and James was one marked by pain, betrayal, and loss. But it was also a journey marked by reflection and understanding, a journey toward the painful but necessary truth that peace cannot be found by seeking to control others, by removing obstacles from our lives. It is found by accepting the world as it is, by understanding our own weaknesses and failures, and by forgiving ourselves and those who have wronged us. What do you think of Claire's story? Can desperation and frustration truly justify taking a life? What do you think James could have done differently? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and engage in a discussion about the lessons this story teaches us about the consequences of our actions and the power of forgiveness. Don't forget to like and share the video if you found it impactful. Your support helps us keep bringing these thought-provoking stories to you.